All right, folks, can you take a seat? We're going to get started with the next panel. All right, hope you all had a good chance to make some new connections. We're going to move on to the next panel, which is going to be focused on AI, which is probably a term you haven't seen at any other conference this year, right? But to be specific, we're going to talk about a few issues. We're going to talk about privacy, data ownership, and access to computation. So basically, I'll paint the picture a little bit for you folks. Before I do that, let's actually introduce three people sitting next to me, right? So they're not just sitting here going, oh yeah, that's great. Jaya, please.
Hello, 1, 2, 3. My name is Jaya. I work for a company called NIM Technologies, and we build privacy tech. And one of the main technologies that we've built is something called a noise-generating mixnet. So what a noise-generating mixnet does is it adds noise to your traffic patterns as you do things across the internet. And by adding that noise to traffic patterns, the patterns become less vulnerable to surveillance and, specifically pattern recognition forms of surveillance, so AI-driven surveillance. So that's a quick introduction to who I am. Lots more rabbit holes to go down.
Well,
passing on.
Dr. Jaya Breka, correct?
Yes, exactly. I have an academic background as well.
We had Jaya on last year, and she's one of the few PhDs I know in blockchain. So ask her your blockchain questions afterward. David.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Packman. I'm a managing partner at Coin Fund. We're one of the oldest crypto native investing teams out there. Been at it since 2015. We operate 3 different investment strategies. We have a seed stage strategy, a sort of early venture stage strategy, and a liquid markets strategy. And we invest across the entire crypto landscape, blockchain, Web3, decentralized networks, you name it. Typically early stage, though. And we're about 31 people, half are investors in New York, Boston, Miami, and a couple other spots, too. Nice to see you all.
And Jared.
Hey folks, I'm Jared. I build developer tools for AI engineers and lead a team at the Near Foundation solely focused on supporting founders building at the intersection of AI and blockchain.
So people might wonder, why AI and blockchain? Did we just want to put the 2 buzziest words together?
Yes, we did.
Yes. Yeah, we did. But also there's some serious tech being built there. Like if you think about what Jaya is talking about, probably, 12, 15 years ago, folks were thinking that we would just have this nice secular trend toward, more democracy, more liberalism, more democracy, more liberalism. And if we just had more opener societies, I meant to say that. We had more open societies, well, we would just have more competition and then more tech, and those societies would outcompete the other societies. That's not really been the case. It seems like the authoritarian societies and the trends within democratic societies that are tilting toward authoritarianism seem to be winning a little bit. And so when you take those trends and you pair them with really powerful models that can start to use, whether with or without permission, public data sets and private data sets as well, privacy becomes a pretty important issue. So we're going to focus on one issue here today. One is data ownership, and the other one is going to be, there are about 7 companies on the planet who are producing the access to the vast majority of the world's compute resources, right? Just to give you one example, Microsoft is doubling their data center production every 6 months, and data center usage of electricity globally is now almost about 3%. So it just crossed 3%. We're talking about, probably more than half of the world's countries easily, like in terms of energy consumption. And so when you concentrate this kind of access to technology behind a handful of companies, you're basically just creating a race to the bottom for rent seeking, right? So it becomes very important to build alternatives for startups even, and everyday people to access compute resources so they're not locked into one ecosystem. That ecosystem can dictate everything from the rights to your data up to what you can do with it, and might end up being, in the worst scenario, something that's as authoritarian as a government, right? So that's kind of the background that we have here, and I guess a good place to start would be, let's look at the current landscape of data ownership. So, Jaya, I won't steal the words out of your mouth. Tell us a little bit about, maybe bring in Meredith, anyone else you'd like. Tell us a little bit about the current landscape and why you folks decided to focus on this at NIM.
Yeah, so the current landscape, well, I guess, yeah, we talked a little bit about Meredith. This is the president of Signal App, and the concept that she uses of AI as a surveillance derivative, which is such a nice way of describing it because it's quite, truthful. It's quite like honest. Okay, so what is it that AI is built on? It is built on a couple of decades of surveillance, right? I think what is maybe missing there is that it's not just surveillance and it's not just this kind of like, this deal that the NSA did with Google, back in the day that kickstarted the whole like surveillance-driven business model that literally came to dominate the entire internet. The other element there that's maybe missing a bit from that narrative is exactly the question of ownership, right? And the fact that like not only is it surveillance-driven, but also if we look at what the internet was in the kind of like 90s, early 2000s, you have a bunch of people that are like, yay, let's collaborate and do something nice online. We put up loads of content and, and everyone's just kind of like doing all this stuff, not knowing that all of that stuff was just going to go straight into, lining someone's, data centers and pockets. So that's kind of like what I like about that term is it's quite an honest description of how the AI industry emerged. And paints a good kind of picture of where we're at now. The other thing that I think is like worth, so like the question of where privacy comes in is then like, the next one, which is also why I like Meredith as a character, because she obviously went from Google to Signal, and it shows that kind of very clear, like quite deep connection between, the AI industry and then, where privacy kind of can, let's say, like cut in and become almost like a blockade on that. So the mental model that I use is like, you have a kind of data pipeline, right? And that data pipeline goes from this kind of scenario of like theft and surveillance where someone's sucking up, all the available data and pushing people to produce more data, which I think is also an important point. And then all the way through, the various data intermediaries and markets that happen to the actual kind of the place of the, derivative, the AI services and so on. So the question is, where does privacy come in as a blockade in that data pipeline? And as a blockade, it can kind of force a different direction. So, the way I think that I think about technology is like technology has a lot of different pathways it can take in terms of where innovation goes. And when you put a blockade, innovation kind of changes. It needs to change direction, needs to go somewhere around that blockade. So for me, the mental model here is like, in order to have any sort of quality and equitable AI, you need to have a precondition of privacy as the default, because only at that point can you make deliberate decisions of when data should be produced, by who, under what ownership conditions, and what sort of derivatives should be created on top of that. So that's how I see the kind of intersection of the two. And in terms of the landscape today, of course, we've had, regulation come in, and I think the GDPR was like, from my perspective, like I actually think that if you had real implementation or like enforcement of privacy regulation, copyright regulation, and labor law, you might not even need AI regulation, right? It covers like most of the bases, really. But the problem is these things don't get implemented or enforced, right? So, but we are starting to get to a place where we can see that data pipeline, and then we can start making some better decisions. So yeah, that's the benefit that I've seen from the regulatory interventions, is that we're starting to understand the shape of the problem.
So the way that you put this together, open internet, web 2.0, user generated content, who had a Zanga, right? Stuff like that. But that's just become fodder for these machines, right? And crawling the internet. Now, David, I think you come at this from an interesting perspective as well, because you've been in the investing in the internet for a long time. You've seen many different waves come and go. I'm interested in your take on this because, we did a podcast with you earlier this year in January. One of the issues we covered was just everything on the internet being used by OpenAI for free. Or just without any attribution at all. And it kind of goes to your point around privacy. So I'm just curious to know from your side, how has this dynamic shaped the wider internet? And then in terms of investment opportunities, How are you thinking about that?
Well, I think some of this is the law of unintended consequences. So if we go back to the beginning of Web 2, it was uncommon to pay for a lot of services on the internet. Most of the internet was free and ad-driven. And so I think the impetus to launch new services and make people pay to use it would have been an uncommon and impetus and probably met with a lot of friction. So a lot of our social media companies and Web2 companies raised a lot of capital and offered free services. You can participate here, use our communications tools, post pictures, have conversations, and we're just going to show a lot of ads to you. So your data exhaust, which was the common phrase back then, is just what we use to target you. And that was the deal that so many of us made, and our conversations are widely now on the internet and our pictures for a long time. But we didn't really think through what happens to all the data that we're giving all these companies. And we went through a few scares where, well, maybe suppose the government is hoovering it all up, suppose a foreign government is hoovering it all up, suppose law enforcement is hoovering it all up, like what, there's some invasion of privacy concerns, but most people on the internet haven't been like incensed about privacy. But now another thing happened, which is, well, suppose AI is reading it all. Suppose a new technology comes where it's just going to read everything and get smarter and build its value this way without permission and without compensation. None of us imagined that in 2008 that this was going to happen. But this is the bed we made for ourselves. And by the way, we don't know whether this is permissible yet, right? In the US, we have copyright law, but these cases have to be adjudicated by federal judges to determine whether fair use is an appropriate defense for OpenAI and Google and everyone else who's read all of our words and used our words. So we don't know the answer yet. It could be fixed pretty quickly, right? I'm not holding out a lot of hope for it, but we could have rulings by federal judges who say, like, this is not fair use, and it would invalidate all of the OpenAI models, and they would need to be rebuilt, and they would have to pay for content, or at least get your permission. So I don't know this can happen, but I'm just saying, like, this is an in-progress conversation. So what are the alternatives, though? And one is, well, I would say sort of two main streams of thought. One is, most internet technologies, since they're built on networks, are network effect technologies where the big get bigger. And so, like, how many super large AI models do we have today? Well, we have very few of them. We have, like, 6, 7, 8. I mean, I might be, give or take 1 or 2. I think we're in the right realm, because the costs of training them is extremely expensive, and there's scarce access to the GPUs and derivative chips necessary. So there are two axes to find an alternative. One is to distribute more compute power to more people at lower cost in some way, maybe without subsidy, but like at lower cost. And I'm sure we're going to talk about decentralized compute networks. And the other is to put data into marketplaces where we've opted in to let our data be used for training, but get paid for it and require its use to be paid. In order for that to work, though, I think you need a ruling that says the internet can't be raped, for your enjoyment and building your big models. But in the event that happens, I think sort of data marketplaces can emerge. And I think our argument is decentralized technologies are ideal places to build both of those things, right? So this is the intersection of Web3 or crypto and AI. Can we build decentralized compute networks that bring down the cost of GPU and other chip access for training? And can we build decentralized data marketplaces where each of us put content into it and get paid something back when our data is trained on? And so I think that's an investment theme of ours.
That's a really good segue, I think, to jump over to Jahed at Near, because you folks have seen this from one end to the other. The founder of Near was one of the original 8 authors on the Transformer architecture paper that is, kind of kickstarted this whole thing, right? But they as an organization took a circuitous route because they realized, like, oh, but if we want to be able to do that, we need to be able to actually attribute data. We need to be able to own it. We need to actually have a whole bunch of things built first. So I turn to you, Jahed. I want to ask you, kind of dovetailing off of David's last comment here, what's Near doing in that space? Maybe you can make it pretty concrete around, this emergence of user-owned AI. How are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I'll give a concrete answer, and then I'll parlay more to a story just for framing.
Please.
Concrete answer is the quality of the model fundamentally is correlated with the quality of the data set. And as models get better, that means those data sets are going to require more and more context. Context, in other words, means more personal data, right? If you've ever interacted with ChatGPT or Claude and used Sonnet 3.5, those are incredibly powerful models, but what they lack is your personal context, right? And as these models get better, that is where privacy starts to become more and more invasive. I think our belief at Near is we actually are still very much at day zero and haven't yet seen how fast this can really accelerate. If you've ever used Apple Pay or any NFC chip to pay, I think it's incredibly powerful technology because you don't think when you just tap, right? We haven't gotten to that moment yet where AI is invisible. And when AI does become invisible, that's where privacy, I think, truly escalates. Now, fast forward to today, why does that actually matter? And what is it that we're actually doing? To the points that were raised, what we focus on at Near are the key components. When we say decentralized AI or the intersection of AI and blockchain, what we're really talking about is distributing the systems that power a data pipeline, right? And so you have fundamental training data. If you've ever taken any action on the internet, that has probably become some big research labs training data. That data is then labeled and processed and fed into computations to create a model. Right, an AI model simply is just a wrapper around a data set. Right, when you interact with a model, you're just interacting with a very labeled and segmented data set. But the core issue with that, and I think there has been numerous folks covering this, whether it's around Reddit data. If anyone has ever used monster.com, that data has been sold and become trading data, right? So primary sources of where people have interacted on the internet have now become the basis in which these models are trained on. Right now, it may not necessarily feel overly urgent, right? But again, if you assume we continue to move at the pace we have moved, and these models continue to get better, and we perhaps solve some of the scalability issues around hardware, around data availability, these models are going to get better, right? And so that's where I think it really becomes urgent. And for us, kind of concluding here, sorry for the long-winded answer. Concluding here, we have really framed this concept of user-owned AI, or truly enabling every individual to not only own their data, but determine how that is used when these models are trained, right? Because right now, permission is not necessarily being asked.
So before I move on to getting into the concrete, like alternative models of data ownership, does anyone have a take on each other's takes?
I do.
Please.
Well, I think, but I might also be kind of jumping the gun on like what your next questions are going to be about. But I think it's interesting that we're talking, because I think there's, I mean, we talk about, kind of individuals having AIs, individuals owning their data. I think there is a little bit of a contradiction there, exactly with this point of like the network effects and the fact that data really has value in its relationality. And so, I'm also wondering, like, I guess a conversation I'd like to bring to the table also is exactly the kind of alternative models like outside of market also. So where we're understanding like data sets also as like, I don't know, the new libraries or, kind of collective shared knowledge spaces that represent a certain kind of epistemology of a community or a kind of, professional community or a discipline, academic discipline or whatever else. And we kind of try and understand, where is it appropriate to have a market, where and when is it appropriate to have a market, where and when is it appropriate to have other types of, governance structures around these sorts of data sets, exactly to enable that relational value to come through, and that value to be shared in a sensible way, but without kind of reverting back to the kind of individual ownership. Because I think the individual selling their data, I mean, there were some experiments on that, like, I don't know, 5, 6, maybe even 10 years ago. And for most people, their individual personal data is just not worth that much, right? Like the worth comes later in its relation to other bits of data and so on. And also there's a certain kind of, potential like danger like dystopian sci-fi to be written around, you know, the kind of working classes that have nothing other than their personal data to sell or whatever. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's some things here that some problems we can preempt here already, right? Where perhaps a kind of more collective approach might be more appropriate, and there's a kind of market layer that happens at you know, for certain kind of like use cases or whatever.
Got it. David, you can totally pass on this, but I'm curious on your take, just because you folks have invested in a couple of these sorts of zero knowledge data marketplaces, training platforms. How does that comment resonate with you in terms of like maybe there are some areas where market dynamics come into play, others where either it's regulatory driven or purely there's just a way to lock it down if you're an individual actor who wants to collectively bargain with other actors to build a data set that might be useful? Curious on your take.
Yeah, so I'll argue against myself. Here's what we're up against. If you want to make a data marketplace, we'll make a training data marketplace. First question is, so what data do you have? Do you have enough of it? Is it high quality? Do you have the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Economist? Do you have like medical journals? Do you have like scholarly papers? Like, do you have like Reddit type conversations, just conversational stuff? Like, what do you have? Do you just have a small bunch of people who threw their blogs in? Because that's not interesting enough. It's not big enough. And it's probably not additive to what has already been trained upon. To your point, like as the models get bigger, they're starved for more data. Experiments have been done already. What happens if you make more synthetic data, right? So you take the output of the models to train them, and that quickly brings quality down. So that's not the answer. The answer is like get more quality data, non-synthetic data. Which, by the way, I don't know how much more there's going to be. Like, I mean, I know we're making a lot of pictures and words on the internet, but I guess the models will always have to train on it. So I think the argument against the like let's make some decentralized data marketplaces is, okay, well, there's a cold start problem. Like you need a whole lot of data to make your marketplace interesting to the people who want to buy the data. So that would be sort of first hump to overcome. But maybe I'll give an example of where I very much agree that like what models are starved for is very large data sets with a whole lot of context. But there are some other ways to sell your data, and I know we've talked about this for a decade on the internet. Like you're going to sell your personal data instead of give it to Google. No, you're not. But here's an example where people are. So we are investors in a company called Demo. And it's this little device that you plug into your car, or you just connect your like car login to this network. It's a decentralized protocol, and your driving data, anonymized, but your driving data goes into the network. The performance of your car at miles per gallon, the status of your tires, the oil change information, how fast you drive. And who's interested in that? Well, like people who sell auto-related products, auto insurance, tires, and they would love to have data-driven way to send advertisements to you, like, hey, your tires are almost bare, like you should buy new ones, and here's a deal on them. And the way they do that on the traditional internet is they wait to see what you search for, right, in Google. And it's becoming harder for them to target you that way because of the death of IDFA, and who knows, maybe the cookie goes away at some point. So they would love to advertise or speak to you or say, I'll make an offer for your car because I know the VIN number and I know I'm looking at the data. And so if you connect your car to this network, you get Demo tokens, crypto tokens every week, proportionate to the amount of like miles you drive, and those have economic value. So you're collecting rewards every week for being part of the network, and then you receive like super targeted offers. And there's like real value here. It's like $30 a week, depending on the price of the token. So it's like a free tank of gas or a bunch of charges on your EV. So here's a model that there's more than 100,000 people who have connected. It's growing quite nicely. So I think there are some examples we can concoct of like what is a user's data worth.
Nice. And Jared, the alternative model for you folks being just a user-owned AI or user-owned data. I'd love to hear if there's any concrete examples of teams that have come through the Near Accelerator or things that you've seen in the last year that have caught your eye and said, okay, there's something that has a bit of traction, maybe in the way that David was talking about, where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, you have your little bit of data here, that's cute. But like, what have you guys seen through the accelerators that caught your attention potentially in this user-owned AI narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think Demo is a great example. I think probably one of the most powerful things about blockchain is the ability to incentivize coordination. There's a company called Vana that is essentially very similar to Demo, but a protocol for data monetization networks. They had one of the first so-called data DAOs, or community of individuals who are contributing their data in a user-owned way, called the Reddit Data DAO. They got 1 million people in a handful of weeks to contribute their data as a incredible proof point that there is value there, that people actually do care about this, right? And is it very much probably on that early adopter spectrum? Yes, but it was a really incredible proof point, I think, for the market as a whole, that it really has gotten people thinking, and now from a founder and just developer perspective, thinking about building downstream use cases of how do we decrease that barrier to entry and create more awareness around these opportunities for everyday individuals.
That's pretty cool, and it totally front runs my question, which is going to be around, what do we need to do to get people to participate in these? Because David and I have talked about this quite a bit, where it's like, Jaya, like you said, there have been studies done on this where people said, well, one, what's the worth of the data? Extrinsically, it's just not worth it, usually if it's just your own data. And then, you look at it a bit further and you're like, well, do you care about it? And most people are like, no, I'm just trying to use the internet. Right. So, but that's a really cool data point, though. It actually kind of goes and flies in the face of that, like, gut feeling that we've had here in the space. Very cool. Now, with the remaining time we have, we want to shift to the other side of this. So we've talked about the oil that goes into the engine, data. And now we're going to talk a little bit about that thing that's pumping out the computations, right? The data centers, whether they are decentralized or not, and access to compute, right? So in the last couple of years, there have been a number of new VC funds and founders coming into the space who have been talking about the sovereignty of data, sovereignty of compute. And so sovereign compute is one of these new metaphors that's kind of been taking off a little bit. And the whole idea is just that, to restate it, is that we have a handful of companies across the world who can manage to make the capital expenditures necessary to build the infrastructure, physical and digital, to actually run the computations at scale to make these models useful, right? That's simply not a thing, kind of like the renewable energy panel from this morning, that most people are going to pull together $100 million. That's actually not even enough, right? We're talking about billions just to put in a new data center. If we're talking about a 100 megawatt data center, we're talking about a $2 billion investment, right? And so I want to shift a little bit and talk about this and say, with the centralization of data ownership, at the same time, you have the centralization of the infrastructure. So I'll kind of kick it to each of you first and say, why does this sound like a problem? Right? Like, why is it's not something that a lot of folks are talking about? Why is it an issue?
You mean, why is centralization an issue?
Of centralization of the access to compute.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead.
So I might go a little bit kind of like big scale here.
It's all allowed.
And it relates to a conversation I was having actually just before. But, obviously the centralization of access to compute is centralization of access to some very or increasingly important resources. And when you do have that form of centralization, if we think about like what AI really is, it's a kind of it's almost like, the way I like to think about it is it's an automation of a narrative, really. It's an automation of a take on the world. It's the automation of like, what is it that's important in this world, and how am I going to kind of empower that by automating certain processes around that. And so, if we think of the centralization of the capacity to define the narrative, and define what matters in the world and what should benefit from that sort of kind of automation, let's say, of intelligence, that's really what's at stake here. And that's not a small thing. That's like pretty serious stuff. So, and it's serious stuff not just in terms of the distribution of power, but also, actually, I would say, like, more generally speaking, for the welfare of humanity, because when you do have a centralization of narrative, there's a loss of knowledge elsewhere that happens simultaneously. Yeah. And that loss of knowledge is like, I mean, I don't know, this might seem like a big claim around like what the problem is here, but it's like we're headed straight for like the dark ages, you know what I mean? So that's how serious I see this problem, that the centralization of resources like that really, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. It's the centralization of knowledge production, and it's the limiting of knowledge production. Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. David?
I think the reason this is a super acute conversation now is that actually humanity, at least like Western humanity, has had access to sort of enough compute resources to be as productive as everyone else for like a few decades now. Like if you had a computer or a phone, you can kind of be as productive as everyone else. You get email, you get messaging, you can bank by phone, you can use like spreadsheets, you can query the internet. And when we brought a lot of computing power together and concentrated it, it was good at some things that not everyone really needed to be good at, like predicting the weather, predicting particle physics, like how a nuclear blast can be modeled, wind shear, over a plane's wing. Like those were harder compute problems that you needed a lot of compute for, but it was okay that not a lot of us had like a supercomputer because we didn't really want to go do that. But now what supercomputers are good at is building AI. And that impacts all of us. And if we have to pay abundantly to get access to these models, now we have an uneven distribution of a superpower. So the question then becomes, well, how many people can build the superpower? And the answer is, well, only the people who can like spend $5 to $10 billion. And that number is going up, not down. And even if you had the money, you got to convince NVIDIA or Amazon, maybe a little bit of Google, to like sell their chips to you. So like it's becoming super lopsided. So now this question arises, what do we do about it? And the narrative and what a lot of people in decentralized AI are talking about is, well, we've actually proven when Ethereum came out that we can motivate a whole lot of people, like what I mean by a whole lot of people, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 people, to take their GPUs and plug them into the internet. We'll pay them a little bit, and they will coordinate and build a decentralized compute platform. And we did that. We did that with Ethereum. And so everyone says, oh, wait, we've done that before, and AI is trained on GPUs. Can we get higher power GPUs coordinated in a global network, and then we could democratize access to these ultra clusters so more people can train and build AI models. And if you talk to a lot of academics who work at Columbia or MIT, and if they wanted to actually do research and build a model of 400 billion parameters to compete with Llama 3, they can't get Columbia to pay for the compute time to do it. So they can't actually do research on models that big. They have to go to Facebook or OpenAI or Google to do that. So could you lower the cost of access to ultra clusters by getting a whole bunch of GPUs, high-powered GPUs plugged in together? And that is an experiment underway right now. And we have several networks that are up and running, and some are actually training and building models. We're an investor in one called Prime Intellect. They just announced, I think it's called Intellect One. I think it's like a 10 billion parameter model that's been trained decentrally. I just want to point out, this is a super non-consensus idea among people in the cutting edge of AI supermodel training, because they will tell you that no, it's going completely the opposite way. We're bringing the GPUs closer together. We need them like married together. We're building 4 GPUs in one, 6 GPUs in one, 624 GPUs in one. We need them to be super close. The idea of separating them is like anathema to the notion of building these so this is very much an uncommon idea among the people who are actually building most of the models, but folks in Web3 land are pursuing it. And so I just want to say, like, it's not clear that this works, but it is an attempt.
Jared, how about you folks? I would love to hear a little bit about, Near is sitting probably a $10 billion dollar protocol today, market cap, something like that. And this is very, very important to yourselves, to you, to Ilya. What is Near doing in that space? Because I feel like we've now gone like down the curve. Like you guys are actually very close to what's happening there. So I'd love to hear what y'all are working on in that space.
Definitely can answer that. Maybe just to parlay on what was already said.
Please.
From a technical perspective, why this really matters, and I think just to boil it down to first principles, is when you have 6 to 7 companies controlling this, you're introducing single points of failure to probably one of the most important technologies in human history, right? So that's like the basis in which we're operating out of. Now, what are we doing about it? It's a spectrum, right? Because the reality is it's a very large surface area of problems that are being solved and opportunity spaces. There is what is the immediate thing that people are interacting with today, probably AI agents and foundational models. But then what are some of the areas of frontier research that will become important over the next 3, 5, 10 years? What we've tried to do is take a balanced approach to both of those buckets, right? And really thinking about what we shared earlier is how do we drive not only more awareness around data ownership, but actually make that real through personal agents, right? Typically, we live in a society that is more show, not tell. And so we really focus on making that real. One of the things we're building right now is a truly kind of user-owned personal AI assistant that has full access to your own context, right? You're able to give it as much permission as you want on any a couple different modalities of data that you would own to really experience, wow, like the power of your own data, right? When you're able to fully unlock and access that, right? It's a little bit more than just search in your Gmail, right? It's like search across your entire life context, right? So that's one bucket. On the other side of the spectrum, as was mentioned around distributed training, we actually think that's probably one of the biggest opportunity areas within research, meaning that you are able to build protocols for communication between GPUs, right? Because what was shared earlier, these large data centers, right? You're putting together GPUs to lower that communication cost, right? That's where GPUs get really, really hot and sometimes get fried because they're essentially trying to work so hard. But is there a way for those GPUs to essentially communicate with each other? You're able to split models up into tiny different pieces and globally distribute that, right, across a network. That is something that we're equally excited about, but still need a lot of time to perfect that research very, very early as well. So that's kind of the spectrum in which we've been approaching of how do we make this real today for individuals to interact with, to drive those experiences and awareness, but also trying to build for the future.
To dovetail off of your point, David, about this being a non-consensus point of view, I want to throw this out to the panel. Why should folks look at this and say, Google and Microsoft and Meta have already built all these things for us. They're co-located for a reason. They're co-located next to energy for a reason. Why, what are the obstacles and barriers to even trying to get these things to talk to each other across the world? Why should we even worry about that?
I thought I made a decent case, but apparently not.
Because it's the
concentration of, if it is one of the most important, powerful technologies to come along in a very long time for humanity, then it's in all of our interest to make sure that's not super concentrated in the hands of few, even if they appear kind of, maybe altruistic is too rose-colored, but if they seem like reasonably capitalistic, and so therefore they'll be happy to provide it to you as long as you're paying, because that can change, right? We know that sentiment can change, ownership can change, governance can change, and even people can change. So it just seems like a high level of concentrated risk for a society if we're creating a super powerful technology to have only a few versions of it in the hands of, in control of just a few people. And this is kind of the main value set of decentralized networks to begin with, is shouldn't the networks themselves be owned by the users, be owned by the participants? You can put resources into a network and you can pay to use the network. You can also buy into the network and own it. This feels like a good candidate to try that out on. I don't know that it's going to work. I'm not here telling you we're going to have decentralized AI networks. But boy, if ever there was a technology to really focus this on, this feels like a good candidate.
And then one question on the how, right? Because the race is on, right? One thing to revisit is that I mentioned earlier that Microsoft is doubling its data center production every 6 months. And with that, climate goals are out the door, right? Since 2020, Microsoft's emissions have gone up 22% per year, every year. So the race is on in the centralized world. What are the gaps? What are the hows that we need to negotiate in order to decentralize, to have decentralized AI and alternatives?
I just want to say I'm a skeptic that we're going to get this right. But there's a big debate within my firm, about whether this will work. Jake Bruckman, the founder of CoinFund, who has led this entire investment thesis. And as I think I said, we made 7 investments in the space, but we don't know that we're out of the woods here. Like, don't know that this works. His point of view is, solving this, like, the GPU resources can be far away and there can be latency, and yet you can still train cutting edge models. That's a really hard technical problem. And if you solve it, you've solved a very hard problem that really can change the dynamic. But there is a race going on, right? And the race, like right now, if you were betting, you would bet on the infrastructure that Microsoft and OpenAI and xAI and Amazon are building, because they're so far ahead. So it doesn't mean it's not worthy, but like I think it's a tall task.
Yeah, I would agree. And I actually think that your question is like a broader question to like the decentralization space more generally, is like, if we don't at some point turn decentralization into an actual strategic advantage and not just something that means that everything takes a lot longer to both like develop and implement, the latencies are a lot higher, like everything is just a lot more clunky, but that it's actually turned into, a serious competitive advantage in some form or another, we're going to lose out. But that's also where I think like it's important to think not just like, this is a race, but more like, what is it that decentralization can do that these other models cannot do? So we're not like trying to go head to head, but more like we're trying to do something different and like double down on that. And that differentiator, I think like ownership is definitely an interesting aspect there for sure. But I think it's really, kind of digging out that kind of strategic advantage and really kind of clarify it.
So I'll give a slightly technical answer. I spend my whole day talking to engineers and CTOs, so apologies in advance. I think one of the biggest challenges is this is very much a frontier technology, right? We're taking a very dense AI technology and combining that with a very dense blockchain technology. Typically, that attracts individuals who like complex problems, right? Like really, really smart, talented people. But when you get really, really smart, talented people who like complex problems, typically they don't think about interfaces or designing things that everyday people would use, right? And so one of the biggest areas of opportunity is making things usable. Not only usable for other developers, but usable for everyday individuals who don't have a PhD in machine learning or a computer science degree, right? Which I would say is close to the state of the union right now. I think there's some really, really interesting experiments happening with AI agents right now that I think are starting to spark the conversation, but it's still early. And so one of the biggest time investments we make is how do we make it as easy as possible for somebody new to learn this information and build something of value? Then once they're able to build something of value, how can we then also help them ensure that other individuals are able to access that, right, as well. We spend a lot of time thinking about interfaces and what are the interfaces, whether it is distributed training, whether it's agents, whether it's data ownership. What are the things that are going to actually get people to cross that chasm, for lack of a better term, and care?
All right, we're coming up on time, so I wanted to give you each one more forward-looking statement, just something a bit hopeful, right? We have talked a lot about the path forward for this technology, the hurdles we face around data ownership, the concentration of power on the computation side. Where, maybe you could comment on, where are you most hopeful for where we can make progress?
Well, I'll point at an example maybe. So we've been talking about using blockchains to make payments for like 14 years, right? Like, remember Bitcoin? Well, the whole notion of cryptocurrency was that we're going to use Bitcoin to make payments to each other, which we misnamed and we're wrong about. However, what do we have now? We have a number of really high quality blockchains out there that are scaled and are decentralized. A bunch of them have very low cost per transaction. A bunch of them have potential for high throughput. We have stable coins. So we have we've removed the volatility of cryptocurrencies, and I think it's been 14 years or so, but I think I've got extremely high conviction, and hopefully many of you do too, that most global payments will go over blockchains within the next decade. Like that switch feels like it's getting flipped, particularly with a more regulatory friendly environment in the US. So that's a decentralized network meant to solve a really hard problem where latency is an issue. but it's going to produce. It's producing much lower cost, much higher throughput. It's open 24 hours a day. It's non-political, and it's owned by its users. So if we can do it for payments, maybe we can do it for exchanges and marketplaces, other marketplaces too, and then maybe we can do it for compute also. So I'm offering a sign of hope that there is evidence that we can build decentralized networks a lot of us can own that solve a big problem.
I mean, I'm interested, and I don't know if I'm kind of optimistic.
I knew you would have an interesting answer.
No, but I'm interested to see, like, okay, so AI plus blockchain, these two kind of hype cycles, and some way or another, like beneath the hype cycle, there is something potentially very interesting there, actually. Again, something we were talking about just before the session out in the networking area. That the fact that blockchains are ledgers and allow for kind of ownership and governance structures to be designed, and to kind of verify those ledgers and that data in an interesting way. It seems like a perfect combination, really, to do something pretty fascinating and pretty incredible with machine learning on top of that. So I'm very keen to see how this is going to play out. I think there are some solutions there, and we just need to make it happen in practice.
Jared?
Well, I work full-time in the space, so I'm kind of hedged on this working. But in all seriousness, we do take a very objective view. I think our stance is realistically, given the amount of investment from centralized players, realistically, there's probably a 24-month window for some of the initial solutions that we're working on to actually have a chance to really break out and take hold. And so for us, it's been, yes, a level of optimism, but also a level of realism in making things as usable as possible, and really looking for, I think what was alluded to earlier, what are blockchains great at? What are the areas of opportunity that these centralized players aren't necessarily going to tackle? Obviously, privacy does come to mind, but when we try to frame privacy, I think selling fear doesn't always resonate with people. And so we really look at what are these high value use cases that make people think differently about privacy, and particularly agency is actually probably the word that I'm more trying to allude to, is how do we actually really push for agency? That is my core motivator in this world that is driven by technology. What is my choice in that, right? And I'll just end lastly with a story. I meant to bring this up at the beginning. I'll finish with this, and the last thing I'll say. My wife and I, we just had our first child. Thank you, baby girl. She turned 1 year old, and it's crazy, right? When she was born in November of 2023, really the only model that was really good was GPT-4. And that model today, if you spend any time using AI, that model feels archaic, right? Like GPT-4, I can't even use that today. What? But my daughter's only 1, right? And so that amount of progress happened just in 1 year. And so I often think about, okay, when she's 5, what is that world she is going to live in? And will she have agency over how her school district looks at her previous academic experience or codifies, labels us as a family? And, there's so many layers that, again, become invisible that you don't think about that could be fully embedded into AI systems, right? So I think agency and privacy and data ownership, I think today, again, are probably around very pointed use cases, but we believe it's going to be very horizontal, kind of embedded and baked into everything. And so I'm not that old, but I feel old after just 1 year of raising this baby girl. But it really has put into context the urgency around some of these topics.
We have 2 minutes. Time for one question. Just enunciate and I'll repeat it. Yeah.
Really appreciate all of you for brought what you have to the table. Obviously, you have a lot of experience across a lot of domains. One thing that I kept hearing you say is that it's kind of like, right now it's a race right now to try to figure out who it is that can win out the model war, or the model game. I'm more curious about the sort of the roots of where it is that privacy or the value of the information comes from, because this precedes AI being in the narrative, right? We already know from Sophia Noble's work with Google, as well as with Ben Asayag's work with like the tyranny of algorithms, understanding that like algorithmic bias is like a huge problem. So what I'm very curious about here is like why that's not actually a core part of the narrative, is that the parts of AI that are the most dangerous are that they, I think, and we mentioned this before we got on stage when we were talking about this, amplifies the biases that exist in the data sets that encourage them. So what I'm curious about is like, why isn't it a part of the decentralized AI narrative that the data sets that they're pulling from have biases that are not going to reflect benefits to the people that they are argued to benefit?
Yeah, no, I think that's like I 100% agree with that comment, and I do think it needs to be part of the conversation around decentralized AI. Absolutely. Sorry. I also kind of like the framing of the problem as like a problem of bias is something that I'm not sure is super productive. Like it's been important to put something kind of into the debate, but when you frame something as biased, there's an implicit assumption that something can be unbiased, meaning it's just about getting rid of those biases, but it still kind of almost like defers back to a singular narrative, when actually I think what the deeper point that you're making and also Noble is making actually is really that like it's not so much biases, it's like understandings of the world, which is situated and positioned, right? So like what is it that matters to a specific community? I mean, I was trying to, I guess, bring this in a little bit when I was talking about narrative before. Maybe it got a little bit wishy-washy, but this was exactly, the types of the kind of point that I was trying to make. Is that the potential benefit of decentralized AI stack is exactly that you have a better representation of what matters to a specific community, or like a kind of certain epistemology or a certain understanding of the world that otherwise will very easily get lost. So I completely agree.
I mean, very succinctly, to follow everything that was just shared there, imagine if all of us in this room collectively had a slice of ownership of a AI model, and each of us could go around the room saying, this is something that's really important to me that I want included in this training data, right? And we're going to train this model together, and each of us are going to own this, but we're all going to have a say, right, in how this model is trained. That is what I think is the power of decentralization. However, we're human, right? And bias exists across. And I think that is one of the inherent challenges as this technology gets better. And I think the ways you combat that perhaps can start with just personal ownership and kind of your own 10 square feet of, can you have a model that is just tailored to you, right? I think it's, do you believe in a world of one global model? I think our stance is AGI, or artificial general intelligence, will actually be a large number of models that talk to each other, right? And so then it becomes kind of a series of specific solutions. There's point solutions. So a lot of ways you can look at it, and I will be the first to say I do not know the answer, so I could be extremely wrong in this, but that is what I think it can be empowered through decentralization.
All right. Well, I think we touched on a lot of great subjects. Thanks a lot for all of your time and expertise on this. If you have a question, you can find our panelists at lunch. Sorry to sick them on you. We're 2 minutes over, so let's head on downstairs. Lunch is ready.